Most people don't think of cheap living as something powerful. It usually sounds like limitation, like cutting back, like not being able to afford things, like missing out. And for a long time, that made sense. Because in a world where things felt more affordable, spending a little more didn't always feel dangerous. Living a bit bigger didn't always feel like a risk, and being cheap often looked like you were holding yourself back instead of moving forward. But in 2026, something has quietly changed. Because when everyday life becomes more expensive, more unpredictable, and more financially demanding, the ability to live on less stops looking like a weakness and starts looking like an advantage. That's why cheap living is becoming a superpower, not because people suddenly want less, but because needing less gives you more control, and control is becoming more valuable than consumption. That's the shift. Because right now, a lot of people are experiencing the same feeling. They're earning, they're working, they're trying to stay responsible, but life feels heavier. Expenses take up more space, savings feel slower, unexpected costs hit harder, and the margin between income and expenses feels tighter than it used to. And when that happens, something important becomes very clear. The people who struggle the most are not always the ones who earn the least. They're often the ones whose lifestyle requires the most money to maintain. That's where cheap living becomes powerful. Because the lower your baseline cost of living is, the less pressure your life puts on your income. And the less pressure your life puts on your income, the more options you have. That's the core idea. Cheap living is not about deprivation, it's about reducing how much your life depends on constant financial performance. Because a high-cost lifestyle has a hidden downside that most people don't think about. It requires everything to go right. Your income has to stay consistent. Your expenses can't spike too much. Nothing unexpected can hit too hard. You can't afford too many bad months. You can't slow down. You can't fall behind, because everything is already allocated. Everything is already committed. Everything is already spoken for, and that creates pressure, constant pressure. But when your cost of living is lower, something changes. You don't need as much to stay stable. You don't need as much to recover from a problem. You don't need as much to feel okay. And that gives you something extremely valuable: breathing room. That's what cheap living really creates. Not just savings, breathing room. The ability to absorb life without everything falling apart. And in 2026, that ability matters more than ever, because this is not an environment where life feels predictable. Prices move, costs increase, unexpected expenses show up more often than people expect, and financial systems that used to feel stable can start feeling fragile much faster. That's why the ability to operate on less becomes a kind of protection. It lowers your risk, it lowers your stress, it lowers your dependence on perfect conditions, and that's where the idea of superpower starts to make sense. Because if two people earn the same amount of money, but one of them needs far less to maintain their life, that person has a massive advantage. They can save more, they can invest more, they can recover faster, they can take opportunities, they can handle setbacks, they can say no to bad situations, they can wait. And waiting is one of the most underrated advantages in money. Because the ability to wait allows you to make better decisions, better investments, better purchases, better career moves, better financial choices overall. But if your lifestyle is expensive, waiting becomes difficult, because your life needs constant input to keep going, and that forces you into faster, often weaker decisions. That's why cheap living is not just about spending less, it's about slowing down the pressure on your life. Now, this doesn't mean you need to live extremely or cut everything out. That's where people misunderstand this idea. Cheap living is not about becoming extreme, it's about becoming intentional. It's about knowing what actually matters to you and reducing everything else that quietly drains your money without adding much value. Because a lot of modern spending isn't driven by necessity, it's driven by convenience, by habit, by emotion, by what feels normal. And over time, those things raise your baseline cost of living without you fully realizing it. More subscriptions, more takeout, more small upgrades, more just this once purchases, more convenience. And none of these feel like big decisions, but together they create a lifestyle that requires more money to sustain. And once your baseline rises, it becomes your new normal. That's when things start getting risky, because now your financial life depends on maintaining that higher level, and if anything disrupts it, even slightly, the pressure shows up immediately. That's why lowering your baseline is so powerful, because it reverses that process. It brings your life back to a level that your income can support more comfortably. It creates space, and that space is what gives you flexibility. Flexibility to handle unexpected costs, flexibility to adjust, flexibility to avoid debt, flexibility to save, flexibility to breathe, and most importantly, flexibility to make better decisions instead of rushed ones. That's what people underestimate. Cheap living doesn't just improve your numbers, it improves your behavior. Because when you're not under constant financial pressure, you don't have to react as quickly. You don't have to grab the fastest solution. You don't have to borrow as easily. You don't have to say yes to everything. You can pause. You can think. You can choose. And that's where real financial strength comes from. Not just how much you earn, but how much control you have over your decisions. Another reason cheap living is becoming more powerful is because the gap between income and lifestyle expectations is widening. A lot of people are trying to maintain a version of life that looks normal but costs more than it used to. And because that version still feels reasonable, they don't question it enough. They assume the solution is to earn more, to push harder, to increase income. And while increasing income can help, it doesn't solve the core issue if the lifestyle keeps expanding alongside it, because then the pressure just follows you upward. That's why cheap living creates an advantage that income alone cannot. It breaks that cycle. It gives you a stable foundation that doesn't keep moving. And once you have that, everything else becomes easier to manage. Saving becomes easier. Investing becomes easier. Handling surprises becomes easier. Even enjoying your money becomes easier because you're not constantly worried about maintaining everything. And that's the part people often miss. Cheap living doesn't eliminate enjoyment, it makes enjoyment more intentional. Instead of spending everywhere without thinking, you spend on what actually matters and you reduce what doesn't. That's not restriction, that's control. And in a time where financial pressure is rising, control becomes extremely valuable. Because the people who will struggle the most are not necessarily the people who earn less. They are the people whose lives require more money than their system can comfortably support. And the people who will stay stable are the ones who have reduced that requirement, who have lowered their baseline, who have built systems that don't depend on constant financial strain. That's why cheap living is becoming a superpower, because it protects you in ways that income alone cannot. It gives you flexibility, it gives you resilience, it gives you options. And in an uncertain environment, options are everything. So if you've ever felt like living cheaper means falling behind, it might be time to rethink that. Because in 2026, the person who needs less is often the one who is actually ahead. Not because they're limiting their life, but because they've built a life that doesn't require constant pressure to maintain. And that might be one of the most powerful financial positions you can be in right now.